There is one constant in the security world. The attackers will continue to evolve their methods as the defenders find ways to thwart attacks. So it should come as no surprise that attackers are doing anything they can to slip into your networks through whatever means are most expedient. Often, the most expedient path is to bypass technology-based defenses, partially or altogether, and target your end users, seeking to exploit human nature. Your users stand, knowingly or not, at the front lines in the battle to secure your network as a vast horde of cybercriminals are on the move, readying their next wave of attacks, and the battlefront is email. So what are the next trends in email security? Is there hope? And what can you do now to protect your organization? What people, process, and technology strategies can be effective in helping to mitigate the threats? These are important questions that every security leader, CIO, CEO, and board member should be asking. Join us for this video as two of the industry's leading experts, Gartner research analyst Neil Wynn and KnowBe4's chief evangelist and strategy officer Perry Carpenter, wrestle with these questions, analyze attacker methods, and offer practical advice. Can you describe a couple current methods attackers are using to bypass technical security controls?
So the most frustrating attack that we're seeing in the market today is the payloadless business email compromise impersonation attack. This is, the W-2 fraud, right? Where someone is purporting to be a senior executive in your organization, as an example, right? Targeting someone in corporate finance or HR in an attempt to trick them into making an outbound wire transfer or disclose sensitive data, right, inappropriately, of course. And the reason why those attacks are so clever is because they bypass the traditional approach to email security, which is to focus on the content, right? Because they don't have a URL, they don't have an attachment, which is what's typically inspected by the traditional email security controls. They're easily able to bypass that and really are just a pure social engineering attack that's targeting the human user and their vulnerability to deception.
Are you seeing anything encouraging related to trends and training humans to make safer decisions?
One of the things that I think is encouraging is focusing on real-time teachable moments when it comes to security education rather than the lecture style where it kind of washes over folks and they forget about it later. So in the context of email security, what we're talking about is in-line measures where you're actually able to neuter a real-time threat from a malicious actor outside the organization, take that, and then see if the user clicks on it. And if they do, you're able to interrupt their process, whatever they were doing, and say, hey, you clicked on something that you shouldn't have. Here's why you should have avoided that, and here's how to not do this next time. So it's a real-time way and much more effective than the lecture style. So I think when it comes to email security, because it just interrupts them and it's right there when they do it, it actually is being seen as a much more effective way to improve the education of these users and help them realize the mistakes they made.
Since no single layer of email defense is 100% effective, what is the recommended approach for organizations to take for securing this business-critical function?
You really need a multifaceted approach. The first facet is the technology itself, and particularly, how do you stop bad messages from landing in inboxes? So a secure email gateway, as an example, right, is able to do that, but there's a lot of room for improvement here, and this is really a good front line of defense. Ultimately, you want to reduce the user's exposure to these types of messages first and foremost. The second facet is focused on process and procedure. First component of that is, how do we bolster flawed business processes that can be exploited by social engineering, right? How is it that a single email can be used maliciously to approve a wire transfer of $1 million, as an example? The second component of that is multi-factor authentication. If you look at, for example, the account takeover attacks that are gaining prevalence, multi-factor authentication can be used to stave off a significant percentage of those credential phishing attacks. But that's really the second facet. The third is education. And that's always going to be a critical component. As long as humans are involved in a process, they're going to be vulnerable to deception, and it's still trivial to impersonate trusted entities such as SaaS applications like DocuSign or Box, or senior executives in your organization like the CEO or CFO, or a trusted business partner. So that human element is always going to have to be addressed as long as they're involved in a process.
How should mobile threats via email be treated differently?
Mobile threats for email are very tricky. The first reason is because it's hard to interrogate the sender of a message. If an attacker is purporting to be your CEO and using your CEO's name in that sender field, you're not able to hover over that sender's name and see who the underlying reply to address would be like you could on a desktop or a laptop. That's an inherent flaw in mobile device email clients. So it makes it very tricky to understand the fact that this isn't really your CEO or your senior executive or whoever the trusted entity is that's being exploited. And the second piece is for URLs that are included in a message, you're also not able to hover over those and see where those would go very easily. So it's much easier to trick a user into clicking on one of those URLs on a mobile device. If you combine those things with the fact that when a user is on a mobile device, they don't have a full presence of mind. They're often distracted or they're often multitasking, so they're much more vulnerable to these types of attacks because their innate skepticism or the education they've had that you've instilled in them prior might be overridden more easily.
What's the next big thing coming after business email compromise?
So there's two things. One is more short-term, and that's the increased prevalence we're seeing with account takeover attacks, which a lot of organizations aren't prepared for two reasons. One, they don't have multi-factor authentication in place, which is not a silver bullet for these types of attacks, but it can stave off a significant percentage. The second is they don't have visibility into intra-domain or internal to internal email traffic. So if an account is taken over, an attacker is essentially able to move laterally using email within the organization, essentially with impunity. So account takeover attacks are going to increasingly gain prevalence, and this is something that a lot of organizations I speak with are not prepared for yet. The longer term trend that we're going to see is AI and machine learning being used by attackers to craft extremely tailored messages at scale. So now they're going to be able to use open source intelligence, your social media profile, a variety of breach data, and combine that with some additional intelligence on your organization, who you are, and craft a very, very specific message. Now, they can do that now, but it takes a lot of time and effort. Doing that at scale and making that trivial for them to do that is something that most organizations are really not prepared for, and they do have to have a layer of defense prepared to thwart those types of attacks.
What's the next big thing in email threat mitigation?
We've seen time and time again that no single technology or approach is effective on its own. So the next big thing in email threat mitigation is going to be a platform approach, where you have a secure email gateway, something sitting in between your users and the outside world to stop bad things from landing in inboxes. You also have mailbox level analysis that's looking at the trusted relationships between your users and trusted third parties to see if they're being exploited. You also have post-delivery protection, which looks at clawing back messages that have been let through inadvertently, or looking at, rewriting a URL so that that can be neutered even after that message has been delivered to an inbox. And then the real-time education piece that I mentioned earlier is actually an important component of this, right? Making sure that you're taking a malicious email, neutering it, exposing it to users to see how they would react. And if they do fall prey to that type of attack, you're able to intercept that in real time and retrain them and use that as a teachable moment to improve their resilience overall to these types of attacks. The second part of this is how can we show users at a glance whether or not messages are authentic. And we're starting to make some improvements in this area. One of the emerging standards is called BIMI, Brand Indicators for Message Identification. And that's an important component because it builds on DMARC and essentially allows brands to showcase their logo for an authenticated message so that users can see that when they're looking at their inbox and expect to see that from an authentic message versus one that's been maliciously spoofed. So we are making some improvements through some of these emerging standards that need to be looked at. But as I mentioned before, the fact that it's very hard for a user to understand and to interrogate who a message is from. Is it authentic? Is it not? Right? We need to get better in our email clients in particular of how we showcase that to the user so that we give them more information to make the right decision and to ascertain whether they're being exploited or not.
Why can or should we expect humans to be able to detect threats that are able to bypass technical controls?
Some attacks are so clever and so well crafted that they can not only bypass technical controls we have in place, but they can also deceive well-educated users. So we need those layers in place to deal with these types of attacks, but humans are going to be that last line of defense. And what we want to make sure is that they're skeptical of these types of attacks, right? They're skeptical to being socially engineered across a variety of communication mediums, and that we make sure that last line of defense is as resilient as possible. So there's a variety of ways that we can do that, and it really makes a difference because at the end of the day, the attackers are trying to get to the human on the end of the line, and we just need to make sure that they're as resilient as possible to these types of attacks.
Why is phishing so effective?
Phishing is effective because the way that it works is it hits us at our weakest point of humanity. We think across two different paths. We call them System 1 and System 2. And System 1 is very automatic, it's emotion-driven, and it governs about 95% of what we think and do on a day-to-day basis, whereas System 2 is much more deliberate thinking. It's solving math problems, doing hard, deliberate work. A phish will come in and it will exploit us at a very emotional level, using authority or urgency or greed or hunger or curiosity in so many ways. And what that does is it puts us immediately into System 1 and puts us into an automatic response type. And that's really, really difficult to defeat as a human.
What are some of the more insidious email-based attacks that you are seeing these days?
Yeah, so you've heard about things like ransomware and cryptojacking, and we've talked about the emotional component of phishing. What we're seeing right now is that crafty attackers are taking several different things and rolling them all together to try to help accomplish their goals. So let me give you an example, and this is called sextortion. The ultimate goal here is for the attacker to be able to get the victim to pay into an account, like cryptocurrency account. And the way that they accomplish that is that they'll take a very highly emotional phish, combined with a piece of data that they've gathered from the dark web. And here the data is the user's past password that's been exposed through a data breach. And so they'll send out the phish and it will say, hey, we know that you have been watching porn. We've captured it from your web camera that we've hacked, and we've got video of that. By the way, we like your taste in porn, and they'll throw things like that in. And then they'll say, and to prove it, here is your password. And so they're taking this highly emotional thing that somebody's been caught at something that is potentially shameful, combining that with something that is a potentially valid truth, a past password, and then saying, because all of this is true, of course, your mind then jumps and says, oh my God, I've been caught and this is valid, I better pay the attacker. And at the moment that I click on that link to pay, I could either pay into account or I could be downloading malware. It's the attacker's choice at that point.
Why can or should we expect humans to be able to detect threats that are able to bypass technical controls?
Humans are our last line of defense. So many of the social engineering-based threats that come through email are crafted in a way that will bypass any technology-based filter that you put in place because it looks like a legitimate business email. And the attackers are crafty enough at spinning up domains and dealing with all the things that our filters look for in the metadata that they will bypass. And so it lands in your user's inbox, and what the user can then start to do is use some higher order thinking that is far superior to any computer filter that's out there. And they can start to read intent, they can start to look at all the different motivational factors, they can see the psychology behind these things and be able to detect those things in their tracks. And I'm sure that anybody watching this has had that experience where they've detected something that has landed in their inbox, and you've detected it because you're a human and you think in ways that far surpass any email filter that's out there. And so you are the last line of defense.
What's the best way to help end users become a more effective last line of defense?
End users become an effective last line of defense when we've helped inoculate them against the threats that are out there. And there's two ways that happens. Number one is you can help inoculate through just exposure to information. That's what we would call awareness, which is people have now seen these patterns, so they're more likely to say, oh, I've seen that before, I'm not going to fall for it. But the other thing that we can do, this is really interesting, is that you can do behavioral intervention. And so ultimately, over time, you form muscle memory because you train new behaviors. And the way that works is you send a simulated phishing or simulated social engineering event to the end user. It hits them in the context of life that a real attack would hit them in. And number one, if they click on it or fall for it, you have a metric. And so you know how susceptible you are. You know how phish prone you are in that situation. But then also, if they click on it, you can send them to some just-in-time training. And that exposes them to the information again, opens up a little psychological prompt in their head that says, oh, that's what this looks like. Now I can put two and two together. And then the next time around, they're even more prepared. So it's that continued inoculation against social engineering that we can still start to build in the user's consciousness.
Are there any pitfalls to look out for associated with end-user training?
Yeah, there's a few pitfalls that can come up with end-user training. The biggest one that I harp on all the time is that you don't want to give people information at a time that's irrelevant to them. And so my example there is if you're training somebody on passwords, and you're only doing that once a year, well, probably 99% of your employee population are not changing their passwords that day. So it's irrelevant to them. It fades over time. They just don't remember it when it comes time because they didn't care about it when it was presented to them. So that's a big pitfall, is you want to find ways to give people information at a time that is contextually relevant to their lives. The other thing that comes up is, and this can be a gotcha on simulated social engineering, is if you've not gotten in the enterprise buy-in, organizational buy-in to do this, then you can take the executive part of the organization by surprise and disenfranchise them. So it's really important, as with any security initiative, to get high-level executive support and assent to what's going on, so that they're not disenfranchised, taken by surprise, and ultimately your program gets shut down because of those kind of things.
Is there any data backing up the claim that end-user training is effective?
On the data side of things, we've seen some really encouraging numbers that support the use of simulated social engineering as a way to bring down the organization's susceptibility to those kind of events. So we looked across around 11,000 organizations, conducted or just under 250,000 phishing email tests, and looked across around 6 million email addresses within those organizations. And what we saw is, prior to any training, so the first time you send something, the people are unprepared, they've not gotten the information, they've not gotten any behavioral intervention. About 27% of people within any organization will fall victim to a phishing email. Now, the encouraging thing is that just 3 months in, if you send them one phishing test a month combined with some informational training, you see that get cut virtually in half to 13.3%. And then over 12 months of sending at least one phishing email per month, combined with some informational training, you see that go all the way down to just over 2%. So huge reduction in susceptibility just through being methodical, through something that any organization can support and should be able to get the buy-in for.
What's going to be the next big social engineering scam to watch out for?
So in every security professional's inbox, you see vendors sending out advertisements talking about two different things that are being incorporated in their products: artificial intelligence and machine learning. Now here's the surprise thing. Surprise, the criminals are doing the same thing. They're incorporating artificial intelligence and machine learning into their attack methodologies. And now they've got the ability to have an artificial intelligence scour the internet and the dark web, assemble all the discrete points of data about any given target user, put those together, create a convincing email-based attack, send that, it flies straight through any email gateway that's there, lands in the user's inbox, and click. It's done, because it's so convincing that the user just jumps into that system one type of thinking, and it's almost unhelpable because it looks like it was created just for them, because it was.
Final thoughts.
We've talked about this before as an industry. We are in an arms race. The vendors and the creators of security technology will create something that is good and it serves a purpose and it fills a need within the security industry to help organizations protect themselves. But then the attackers will find ways to up the game. They'll bypass the technology, or they'll innovate something new as well. And so we're left in this continued one-upsmanship, where so often the way to one-up the technology is to just go around it and aim for the user and ask the user in a surreptitious kind of way, in a way that employs trickery and social engineering, ask the user for the data. The user gets tricked into it, they give them the data, or they give the attacker the access. Now, the encouraging thing is that what we've found over and over again is that if we're dedicated and methodical about inoculating our users by giving them timely information in a context of life that makes sense, that's relevant to them, and we combine that with a behavioral approach to conditioning, we can train users to detect threats, we can train users to do the right thing, and ultimately we can increase the resilience of the user population, therefore increasing the resilience of the organization as a whole.